Fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power. Probably the most widely spread Mussolini quote, except, like so many supposed quotes on the internet, he never said it. Not only is it not in the sources it's generally attributed to, it has all the hallmarks of a post-war fabrication, probably by an American, and at least as early as the 1990s when I first encountered it, but I suspect the 60s. More than that, it directly contradicts everything that Mussolini and other fascists ever said about the matter. First, the easy rebuttal. It's most often cited as being from an article in the 1932 Encyclopedia Italiana written by Mussolini and Giovanni Gentili, but it's not in the English translation I read, published in 1935 under the title The Doctrine of Fascism. While I don't read Italian, I've discussed this with historians who do, and it's not in the original language either, at least not in any of the editions that they read. But more than that, what Italian fascists meant when they spoke of corporazione is very different from what Americans think when they hear corporation. But fortunately, we don't have to hang this all on bad translations, because we have a native English language source to examine these ideas. Oswald Mosley, when he started the British Union of Fascists, borrowed almost its entire philosophy from their Italian predecessors. So let's look at what Mosley said about this before coming back to Mussolini. Mosley writes in The Corporate State, one of the Buff's many policy statements, "The main object of a modern and fascist movement is to establish the corporate state." What does he mean? As with Italian fascism, the root word of corporation is corpus, body. The whole body is generally directed by the central driving brain of government, without which no body and system of society can operate. This does not mean control from Whitehall or constant interference by government with the business of industry. But it does mean that government, or rather the corporate system, will lay down the limits within which individuals and interests may operate. Those limits are the welfare of the nation, not, when all is said, a very unreasonable criterion. Within these limits, all activity is encouraged. Individual enterprise and the making of a profit are not only permitted but encouraged as long as that enterprise enriches rather than damages by its activity the nation as a whole. But as soon as anybody, whether an individual or an organized interest, steps outside those limits so that his activity becomes sectional and antisocial, the mechanism of the corporate system descends upon him. This implies that every interest, whether right or left, industrial, financial, trade union, or banking system, is subordinated to the welfare of the community as a whole and to the overriding authority of the organized state. No state within the state can be admitted. All within the state, none outside the state, none against the state. That last is a direct lifting of Mussolini's description, which serves as the best single-sentence definition of fascism we're probably going to get. Mussolini gives essentially the same explanation of corporatism in Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions. The corporate state considers that private enterprise in the sphere of production is the most effective and useful instrument in the interests of the nation. In view of the fact that private organization of production is a function of national concern, the organizer of the enterprise is responsible to the state for the direction given to production. State intervention in economic production arises only when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when the political interests of the state are involved. This intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management. It is absolutely and unequivocally subordinating business to the interests of the state. But it's not simply top-down authoritarianism being proposed, but rather an alignment of all interests to serve the welfare of the people through the state. Yeah, that's where it gets iffy in practice, but we're still dipping our toes into the theory here. Back to Mosley on the question of relations between labor, business, and government. Class war will be eliminated by permanent machinery of government for reconciling the clash of class interests and an equitable distribution of the proceeds of industry. Wage questions will not be left to the dogfight of class war, but will be settled by the impartial arbitration of state machinery. Existing organizations such as trade unions and employees' federations will be woven into the fabric of the corporate state and will there find with official standing not a lesser but a greater sphere of activity. Instead of being the general staff of opposing armies, they will be joint directors of national enterprises under the general guidance of corporative government. This corporative government involved the organizing of guilds or associations, not only of skilled trades, but all vocations, to ensure everyone has input and that issues are addressed by people that know what they're doing in that particular field. From the standpoint of labor, the way this happened in practice in Italy and Germany under a similar theory, was that state-run trade unions replaced the old ones, in a sense rendering them meaningless because they were puppets of the government. Which is the same thing that happened to unions under Marxist governments. They quickly became more like state organs that keep the workers in line rather than a way for the workers to effectively bargain or advocate for their interests. Contrary to the lofty fascist ideal of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual, in practice the state has always been a lever for the individuals running it. But in the realm of fascist theory, corporatism is a collectivist idea, and it shares with Marxist socialism a rejection of liberalism. Fascism is definitely and absolutely opposed to the doctrines of liberalism, both in the political and economic sphere. Defining liberalism could be its own deep dive winding through history, economics, and several other disciplines, but for the sake of brevity here, it's broadly that combo of representative government and capitalism. As usual, practice can deviate from theory quite a bit. The capitalism tends to have a silent crony prefix, and government can be representative only in the sense that there are elections between carefully selected candidates who are acceptable to and beholden to the ruling class. But there's at least a tacit acceptance of free markets, individual rights, and the masses having a say in policy. Fascism rejected all that. It rejected the liberal assumptions, including those pertaining to the means of production. And like its socialist cousin, it was explicitly collectivist. Mussolini again. Granted that the 19th century was the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy, this does not mean that the 20th century must also be the century of socialism, liberalism, democracy. Political doctrines pass, nations remain. We are free to believe that this is the century of authority, a century tending to the right, a fascist century. If the 19th century was the century of the individual, liberalism implies individualism, we are free to believe that this is the collective century, and therefore the century of the state. Radicalism tends to be illiberal, and when it arose in the 1920s and 30s, fascism was responding to the same social and economic conditions that drove communist movements. Fascism wasn't refuting their observations, only their proposed solutions. Fascism recognizes the real needs which gave rise to socialism and trade unionism, giving them due weight in the guild or corporative system in which divergent interests are coordinated and harmonized in the unity of the state. This creates a problem for communists trying to stir up a revolution. They need a monopoly on radical solutions, otherwise they start to look like wild-eyed nutters in comparison to people who just say they want good government, more jobs, and the foreigners out. So the Marxists rebranded fascism, a task made much easier post-World War II as there were very few open fascists left to make counterarguments. From a Marxist framework, fascism is capitalism in crisis, a reactionary response of the liberal order to prevent socialists from taking control. Not only does this ignore what fascists themselves said about their goals, but it exposes a problem with Marxist philosophy. In the 1920s and 30s, the Marxists had a decent argument. Liberalism did seem to be failing. The Great War was an absolute catastrophe for all sides, economies were failing, Europe was ripe for revolution just as their theory held was inevitable, and the Marxists latched onto this. Their time seemed at hand. But the fascists were responding to the same conditions, often starting in the same place, and they had two advantages. First, they were fiercely nationalistic, and that appealed not only to Italians but to most nations more strongly than abstract ideas of international class consciousness. Working with their neighbors to make their country a better place for their children works on a primal, tribal level, one that an ideology preaching comradeship of class with people you've never met in places you've never been can't really approach. Second, the fascists didn't pretend to be scientific or materialist. There's no fascist equivalent of dialectical materialism. Fascism embraces fanaticism instead of trying to shroud it in materialist inevitability, and that lets it be much more fluid and pragmatic without having to constantly explain itself to its followers. A doctrine, fully elaborated, divided up into chapters and paragraphs with annotations, may have been lacking, but it was replaced by something far more decisive, by a faith. There are repeated appeals to a spiritual aspect, a pragmatic approach that doesn't reject materialism, but neither does it try to force materialist explanations. Yet, in its own way, fascism is at the same time a deeply humanist worldview. The conception is therefore a spiritual one, arising from the general reaction of the century against the materialistic positivism in the 19th century, anti-positivistic but positive, neither skeptical nor agnostic, neither pessimistic nor supinely optimistic, as are, generally speaking, the doctrines all negative, which place the center of life outside man, whereas by the exercise of his free will, man can and must create his own world. It embraces some ambiguity, sort of you don't have to prove it if you can feel it, so it doesn't have to put on a mask of scientific method or mathematical certainty. And when workers began joining the fascists instead of the communists, this presented a problem, not just in terms of political prospects, but ideologically. Socialism and then communism are inevitable, so the prophet Karl foretold. Some third-way alternative breaks historical materialism. That whole worldview can't fit it into any other box than reactionaries. There's no theoretical place for this new thing, this rival. So they have to reframe it as something else. And so it became capitalism in crisis. And if Marx's economic determinism is exposed as incorrect, well, shift the focus. Gramsci did this most successfully while in a fascist prison. He had a lot of time in his hands, by moving it from pure economics to the hegemony of ideas, locking the working class into a set of self-reinforcing assumptions shaped by their rulers. The workers are becoming fascists because they don't know any better. Oversimplified, but there it is. This line of thinking, coupled with wartime Soviet propaganda, note how the Soviets consistently refer to the Nazis as fascists, thereby equating the two, carried through after the war and warped public understanding of fascism ever since. Umberto Eco's Fascism is a prime example of this. I recommend reading the full essay, but for this overview, the distilled 14 points will do. Read Marx and Gramsci too. Read them with discernment. Anyway, Eco lists his traits of fascism, none of which make something fascist on their own, and fascism doesn't need to have all of them. It's sort of a you might be a fascist if list. Things like appeal to social frustration, or disagreement is treason, or use of some form of newspeak. These are all fairly common with any authoritarian system and sprinkled over a lot of milquetoast liberal politics. But he frames them with his first 2 points: the cult of tradition and the rejection of modernity. Eco was a smart guy. He knew what he was doing. Structuring it this way, he immediately frames anything conservative as fascist adjacent, while insulating leftist politics from what follows, regardless of how authoritarian, oppressive, or newspeak riddle it is. I see what you did there, Bert. This framing of fascism, this just ultra-conservative hyper-capitalism, is contradicted by everything in fascist theory. In practice, it made alliances with the traditionalist right against the communists, and this facilitated cronyism between government and industry. Similarly, socialist states in practice are just full-spectrum monopolies on goods and services. In all cases, power flows largely the same, regardless of the ideology it wears. We can compare systems, but we must be mindful to compare theory to theory and practice to practice. None of this is to say that we shouldn't be appalled and outraged at the corporatism of modern America. The billionaire oligarchs and their pet congressmen, the tech bro fraternity in bed with the surveillance state, the debasing of currency and erosion of savings, cutting the ground out from under the working and middle classes. Only that we should not try to equate that with fascism, that this modern day corporatism of big business infecting everything is in any way what the fascists were advocating 100 years ago. To do so is either ignorant or disingenuous. There's no shame in ignorance, it's totally fixable. That other thing, though. The point being that if you want to fix a problem, you first have to correctly identify what the problem is. And the problem today is not fascism.
Fascism, above all, rests upon teamwork, the ability to pull together, the power to subordinate every interest of section or individual to the nation as a whole.